Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. In this video what we're going to do is cover React Query in great detail. And this is a terrific library to utilize whenever we're handling asynchronous data. So whenever we're making some sort of request to a server to get data. Now it doesn't matter if this is GraphQL or HTTP, this works exactly the same way. So I'm over here in the React Query webpage, and it says that it is a performant and powerful data synchronization for React. And if you look at the description, what it says here is, well, we can fetch, cache, and update our data without touching any global state. So it actually is going to do all of these things for us, as well as store our data in some state that we can utilize throughout our React application. So it's really powerful, and if you go to the docs, there's actually a lot going on. Of course, we're not going to cover every single thing in the documentation, but I'm going to try to cover as much as possible to give you guys a good overview. So what are we going to be building? Well, what we're going to be doing is utilizing this wonderful API, the Rick and Morty API. And what this does is it gives us a bunch of data on characters inside of Rick and Morty. If you don't know what that is, this is just a TV show. That's not a big deal. So over here, you can see here we get a bunch of characters. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that HTTP request and then render them on a React application. And what we're going to be doing is building something exactly like this. So let me quickly refresh. You can see here that we got this cool loading state, and we're actually going to achieve that with the React Query, but I'll show you that in a second. You can see here that we get all of these different characters. And also, there's, I think, maybe around 800 characters in Rick and Morty, and of course, we're not going to show those right away. We're going to have pagination. So you can see here we have this previous page and this next page, and if you click on the next page, you can see that we get different characters. And we're going to achieve that very easily with React Query. So you can see, as you can see, very cool. And as I said, when I refresh, you can see that we get this loading state. And we can, of course, achieve that without React Query, but with React Query, it's a lot easier to achieve. So this is what we're going to be building, and hopefully you guys learn a lot on the way. All right, my good friends, in this section, what we're going to do is set up our local environment in order to start utilizing React Query. Now, there's not a lot of setup that we actually need to do. All we really need to do is create a React application. And I do expect you to know how to do this if you are taking this course. So I do expect you to know the basics of React, such as how to create a React application and how all of these different hooks are utilized within a React app. So this is something that I'm not going to explain. I do expect you to know them. So let's go ahead and create a React application. I actually went ahead and already did this. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to the app.js. And we're going to remove everything in here. Now, inside of the app.css, I added some custom styles. So I actually removed all of these styles and added some custom styles. And if you want to follow along, just very simply, you can go to my GitHub page and you can grab them over here. So you can go to my GitHub page. I'll put in the link in the description below. You can go to the app.css and you can see all of these different styles. Just go ahead and copy and paste them. And of course, I did the same thing with the index.css. As you can see here, we also have some custom styles. So that is pretty much all we need to do for setup. Now, what I want to actually do is I want to make an HTTP request and I want to get the Rick and Morty data. And I want to, of course, render that data inside of our React application. Now, in the beginning, I'm not going to be doing that with React Query. We're going to very simply do it without any sort of library, just do it on its own, and then we're going to convert it to React Query just to see how much simpler and easier it gets. So let's go over here to the documentation. And what we want to do is we want to hit this endpoint right over here. This might be a little bit too small. Let's zoom in. So we want to hit this endpoint right over here, and this is going to give us an array of characters. And as you can see, it's going to give us an array of results, and each result is going to be an object that has character data. So this is the endpoint that we want to hit. So let's go to our React application, and let's create a new directory, and we're going to call this components. And inside of this components, I'm going to create a characters component And this is going to be a functional based component. So I have this really cool snippet, RFC, and it's going to convert it to a functional based component. Now, if you don't have this, you can go ahead and just copy it out, or you can download this extension right over here, and that should give you that ability. So in here, what we want to do is we want to fetch all of the data. So we want to fetch all of the user data, and then we want to render them on the screen. And sorry, not the user data, the character data. So the first thing that we actually need to do in order to do this is to create a function. So let's go ahead here and let's say fetch characters. So fetch characters, and this is going to be an asynchronous function. So let's mark this as async. And the first thing that we want to do, of course, is, well, fetch the user data. So let's use the built-in JavaScript fetch function for this. So we're going to say here, const response is equal to await, and we're going to say that this is going to be fetch, and then we're going to paste in that URL. And then, of course, what we need to do is convert that data to JSON. So what we can say here is const data is equal to response, and this is also going to be asynchronous, so we can say response.json. Now what we want to do is we want to somehow get this state, or get this data and store it somehow in this component level state. So for this, we can actually use the use state hook. So over here we can say characters, and then set characters. And this can be equal to use state. And initially we can have this be an empty array. So in here, after we get all of our data, we can just very simply set the characters to the data that we get back. And what we can also do is console.log the data, so we can see what we get back. Now, of course, what we need to do is we need to call this function, because we're not calling it at the moment. So we can call it on initial load, and to do this, we can use a use effect. So let's go here, use effect. Notice that it auto imported. I'm not importing these things because they can auto import for me, as you can see here. And over here, I'm just going to call the fetch characters function. So fetch characters function, we're gonna go ahead and invoke it. All right, so that's really all that we need to do. So let's actually just look at our data. Let's look at our console just to see that we're getting back everything that we expect. Now, actually, we're not going to get back anything because we're not rendering this characters component. And this actually should be characters because we're going to have multiple characters, not character. So let's just go ahead and quickly rename that. Characters. And in here, we're going to render the characters component. So let's go here. Notice that it auto imported. I'm a little bit worried that I wonder if this is too zoomed in, or maybe this is better. I think this is better. I'll keep it like this. Okay, so over here we have our characters. I'm going to go ahead and save that. And as you can see here, okay, we're getting back some data. Let me zoom in here. I know this is a little bit too small. There we go. We get back info and we get back results. And you can see here that the results is going to contain all of our characters. So in here, inside of the characters, what we can actually do is go over here now. So what we can do here is we can go over here and very simply iterate over the characters. So we can say characters dot results, and then dot map. And then for each character, let's go ahead and render a div. So I'm going to render a div element. And inside of here, we're just going to supply it with the character name. So character dot name. And if we were to go back over here, you can see that we get back these 20 characters, and the color changed because of these styles. All right, cool. So we get back all of these characters. So this worked. However, you can see that this was a little bit of a hassle. We needed this use state. We needed to create this function. We needed this use effect. You know, it was a little bit of a hassle. Plus, there's really no way that if I refresh here, you can see that there's, what happened? Let's go ahead and inspect this. Let's look at the console. I was about to say that there's no way that we can have like a nice loading state relatively easily. So cannot read property. Oh yeah, okay, so this is actually a very common problem. So initially where you might have a loading state, because initially at this point, let's go ahead and console.log the characters. So you can see right away that we have a lot of issues going on. So initially, if I were to console.log the characters, let's go ahead and refresh this. So this is actually going to be not an array, but rather a object. So initially it's going to be an object. So what we can do actually to fix this is very simply go over here and just say data.results. So that we get the results data. And then over here we can just get rid of that. Okay, so that fixes that issue. However, you can see that if I quickly refresh, you can see that we can't get a loading state. And also, what if we messed up something and some error occurs? So for example, let's say that we utilize the wrong URL. You can see that it just completely fails and there's no real way that we can catch that relatively easily. And so we're actually going to look at how we can fix all of these issues with React Query. And so what we're going to do is we're going to refactor this to utilize React Query, and you can see how much more powerful and how much easier it's going to get. Okay, so now it's time to refactor our relatively complicated and cumbersome code to utilize React Query. So the first thing that we need to do is install React Query on our local machine. So let's go over here and let's just do an npm install, and we're going to say React Query. And when I say local machine, I mean our React application. So let's go ahead and do that installation. And there we go. Now it is installed. So the first thing that we actually need to do is import a hook called useQuery, or we're going to get that from React Query. So over here, we can get this hook, and this is called, again, useQuery. So all we have to do in here is go const, and this is going to return an object. So we can destructure out an object over here. And we can say that this is going to be equal to useQuery. Now inside of useQuery, the first thing that we need to provide it is a unique key, a unique query key, so it understands exactly what it queried. And this is really important for some of the things that happens under the hood, like caching. So very simply at this point, we can just call this characters. And then the second parameter is going to be the function that we want to call in order to fetch all of that data. So over here, we're going to say very simply fetch characters. And so over here, we can actually remove this characters array, and we can actually remove this use effect. And then in here, we can remove all of this. And here, we can just return the response.json. So the use query hook, again, it requires a key in order to understand exactly which query it has fetched. Again, important for internal things like caching. And then it wants a function that is going to actually do the fetching and return the data. And as you can see here, we already created this function. Let's go here and let's actually put this at the very top. Okay, and what this is going to do is going to return a few things. The first thing it's going to return is data, and it's going to return some other things like the status. And we can actually utilize this status to see the status of the fetch. Hey, whether it's loading, or hey, is there some sort of error that occurred, or was it a success? Now, we can also use some other ones that I'll talk about a little bit later, but for now, we'll just utilize status. So over here, now what we can do is if the status is loading, so we can say if status dot loading, or if status is equal to loading, this is going to equal to a string. So this is equal to loading. Then what we can very simply do is return a loading state. So we can say something like loading. So ... And then over here, what we can do is we can say if status.error, if some sort of error occurred, we can also show an error state. So we can return this div, and then we can say error. And then lastly, if we bypass all of these situations, then we know we have our data. So over here, what we can very simply do now is just do data. So now we want to use the data that we get back. So we can say data.results.map, and we can iterate over the characters. So you can see how much nicer and more flexible this is. Now we have this cool loading state, and you can see here that it's just a lot easier. We don't have to deal with any of this use effect and use state. So let's go ahead and save that. Let's give this a quick refresh. We're getting some errors here. Let's see why that is. Okay, so this is a very expected error. In order to utilize use query, what you need to do is you need this query client provider, and you need to wrap it around your React application. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to wrap it around, again, our entire React application. So let's go ahead and do it inside of our app.js file. So what I'm going to do is remove this logo, and I am going to import, something from a React query. Now you might imagine exactly what I am going to be importing. I'm going to be importing the query client provider. And I'm also going to be importing something called the query client. So the query client is important in order to instantiate a new client. So over here, what we can do is const query client, and that is equal to new query client. So we can go ahead and instantiate this. And then what we can very simply do is wrap our application with the client provider. So with the client provider. And then over here, what we need to do is supply it with the client. And that's going to be the query client that we created. That's pretty much all we need to do. And now we should be able to utilize the React query library inside of our React app. And as you can see now, we're getting back our data. So this is working exactly as expected. What's nice about this is we get the loading and the error feature that we don't get right off the bat when we don't utilize React query. So for example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly refresh, and very quickly you're going to see the loading state, and then you're going to see the actual array of characters. So just watch really quickly. You can see very quickly we got that loading state, and then we had our array of Rick and Morty characters. So just to quickly illustrate this, let's actually right click here and go to the inspect. What we can actually do is mimic slow internet by going to the network. And then what we can do is we can go to throttling, and we can just do slow 3G throttling, which will mimic slower internet access. Thus, we're going to be in the loading state a lot faster. So if I were to refresh this, you can see here we get loading, and then we get our items. Okay, and again, we didn't get that feature right away. Now, what if we made a mistake or our server threw an error? Now we also get the error state right over here. So for example, if I were to change this, add an extra R, kind of mimicking an error state, and I were to refresh this, you can see it's loading, it's trying to fetch as much as possible. And then at some point it's gonna time out, and then you're gonna see the error state. Okay, cool. So that's really pretty much all that it is that we need to know. So let's go ahead, before we dive into pagination, let's go ahead and actually create our real application. Let's actually create the cards and everything of that nature. So in order to do this, what we're going to need to do is create a character component that is going to hold the card. So let's go over here. And in here, we're going to create a character component. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to say character.js. And this character.js is going to be a very simple function-based component. And this function-based component is going to take in a prop called character. And this is going to contain all of the data that we get back from the server. So if we go to the documentation for the Rick and Morty API, you can see that we get back the name, we get back the status, we get back the species, etc. So let's go over to our React app. In here, let's give this initial class a class name of card. I'm going to go ahead and close this for now. And then let's utilize the image. And then for the source, this is going to be character.image. So character.image. And if you don't want to copy this, you can just very simply get it from my GitHub page. Completely fine. We're going to say here class name. And we're going to say text container for the class. And then in here, let's give it an h3. We're going to give this h3. This is going to be the character.name. Okay. And then over here, let's do a p tag. And let's actually give this a class of status. So class of status. And this is going to tell us whether they're alive or not. So we can do character.status. And then also we can say, well, what species this character is. So we can do dash and then character.species. Now there's a few more things that we need to add. Let's add another p tag. Let's give this a class of title. I'm using emit here. And we can say here last seen on. So what planet were they last seen on? And then over here, let's have another p tag. And then over here, we can utilize character.location.name. So you can save that. And now, again, I'm getting all this data from here. So the name, the species, the location, etc. So now what we can do is go to the characters right over here. And instead of having this div, we can just return a character. And notice that I auto imported it. And then over here, we can get the character and just very simply pass that in like that. And if everything everything did not go completely as planned. It's almost there. It actually kind of looks pretty decent, to be quite frank. But of course, I want to fix up the spacing over here. So in order to do that, let us go to our app.js. And then inside of our app.js, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap everything here. I'm going to cut everything out. I'm going to wrap everything here in a div called container. And then over here, I'm going to have an h1. I'm going to call this Rick and Morty for the title. And then I'm going to paste everything back in. So now, as you can see, we're getting close. We're getting close for sure. We are missing, I think, some classes over here. So let's go to the characters. And inside of the characters, what we're going to need to do is we're going to have to wrap everything inside of a div that has a display of flex. So let's go over here to the characters. And over here, we're going to have this div equal to, and we're going to have it be equal to, and we're going to say characters. So characters. And at that point, there we go. Okay, cool. And we get, of course, we get 20 characters. So this API gets us 20 characters. And then if you want the other 20, then we go ahead and fetch for the next 20. And this is what we're going to get into in the next section. We're going to look at the pagination aspect of it in the next video. The last thing that we need to discuss is how we can perform pagination in React Query. So in order to understand this, what I went ahead and did is I wrote this console.log to console log the data. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to inspect. I'm going to do a quick refresh and go to the console. And if I were to do that, what is going on here? Why can't I remove this? There we go. If I were to do that, you can see initially we get undefined, which makes sense because this is going to be the initial loading state, and then we get our data. And our data is an object with two properties, info and results. Results is going to be the array of users. Info is going to show us a little bit of information about the query we just made. You can see here we have count, which is the total number of characters we have. We also have this next URL, as you can see here. And sorry, count is number of characters we have, yes. And then over here, we have this next URL. So we actually need to hit this endpoint to get the next 20 characters. So it's exactly the same endpoint, but we have this query parameter over here that states that the page is equal to 2. Over here, this also says how many pages we have. And over here, we have this previous. So this is going to give us the URL for if you want to go to the previous 20. This actually makes sense that it's null because initially it's going to start at page 1 and we can't go anything previous to that. But if we go to page 2, this actually should give us a previous. Let's actually give that a go. So over here, I'm going to say query page is equal to 2. I'm going to go ahead and save that. Let's do a quick refresh here. And now you can see we have different characters. And don't mind the styling. It's okay. This isn't a course about styling. And now you can see if I go to info, we actually have a previous and a next. So this is going to be really, really helpful. So what we need to do is we need to actually somehow dynamically add the page in here. So what I can do is I can change this to template literals. And then in here, I can say $, and then page. And over here, I can create a new state. I'm going to say const page set page is equal to use state. And initially, I'm going to set that to 1. So what I want to do is I want to have the ability to change the page and then refetch the query. Now, how are we going to get this page in here? Well, we can actually pass it in through here, but it's actually recommended to pass it in utilizing the use query hook. And there's actually a couple reasons for this. For one, right now, when we start making multiple queries, we're still using the same character key. And that's not good because, well, the queries are changing. Now we're going page 2, page 3, page 4. So the queries are changing, so we actually need to supply it with a more dynamic character key so internally it knows how to cache everything. So instead of utilizing a string, what we can do is we can utilize an array. And then inside of this array, what we can do is supply it with multiple keys. So for one, we can say the characters. And then for 2, we can say the page. And that ensures that each query is going to have a unique character key. So if I want to go for page 4, it's going to be characters 4. If I were to go to page 6, it's going to be characters 6. So this is going to ensure that it is absolutely unique. Now what we can actually do is access these character keys inside of this function that we passed in right over here. So let me just show you this. I'm just going to say anything for this. I'm going to say, I don't know, let's just say Kobe. I'm going to change this for now, but let's just give this a variable name called Kobe. And I'm going to just console.log Kobe. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and inspect this. And you can see we get this object. Or let me actually remove the data. Let's give this another refresh again. And we should get this object right over here. And you can see here we have the query keys. So we have the query keys. And inside of the query keys, we have this right here. So now what we can do is very simply just take the second element in this query key array. So over here, we can actually destructure out the query key. That's why I called it whatever, because we were going to destructure something out anyways. And then in here, we can very simply say query key of 1, because this is going to be the second character. Okay, so that's really all it is that we need to do. And as you can see here, it's still going to work just fine. And if I were to change this to 3, it's still going to work. It's going to change it, as you can see, to the third characters. Or the fourth characters. And what's nice is I actually didn't even have to update this. So you can see here save. Let's save that. You can see right away it actually changed the query. Okay, so this is terrific, but this obviously still doesn't solve the pagination. Well, I mean, we're getting there, but what we need to do is we need to add some buttons that are going to be responsible for actually doing the pagination themselves. So right below here, let's add a div. And inside of this div, I'm going to add a button. So I'm going to say button. And inside of this button, I'm going to have a previous button. And then I'm also going to have a next button. So a previous and a next button. So the first thing that we're going to do is let's work on the previous first. So very simply, the previous, what it's going to do is it's going to take the page and subtract it by 1. However, if the page is already at 1, then we want to disable this button. So over here, let's do disable. We're going to say disable is equal to, and this is going to be either a true or false value. So we can say very simply here, if the page triple equals 1, then we want to disable. And as you can see here, now we're disabled, so now we can't do the previous. Okay, so that's good. Else, then, if we're able to actually click it, then what I want to do is I want to set the page to the page -1. So that to the page -1. And there we go. So now if I were to refresh this, oh yeah, sorry, I made a mistake here. Let's get rid of this. This should be a callback function. So let's go here. We're gonna say set page to page -1. That should work. Okay, awesome. And if for some reason we're still getting previous here, so page is equal to 1. This should disable it. I'm not really sure why that's not disabling it. Let me cut this out for a second. Why all of a sudden does it not disable it when I add that? Let's go here. Let's go here. Let's go here. And over here, let's actually change this up a little bit. We're going to have on page. And then on page, we're going to have a callback in here. And this is going to be the old page. And then over here, we're going to say that for the previous, it's going to be old -1. So old -1. So let's go ahead and refresh this. Okay, there we go. Works perfectly fine. Okay, so that's the previous. So this should work. And if I were to change this to 2, what we should do is able to click on the previous. And as you can see here, we get the previous. And then we're not able to go anymore. Okay, so let's go back to 1 here. So the next thing that I want to do is the next button. So the next button is going to be a little bit complicated because when we hit the end of the list, we don't want to have the ability to click on the next button. How do we figure that out? How do we figure that we hit the next? Well, we figure out that we hit the next once the next value in that info object is null. Let me illustrate. So let's go here. I'm going to do a quick console.log of data. I'm going to inspect this. And we're going to go here to the console. And over here, you can see that we have 42 pages. And you can see that we have this next value. So let me go to actually the 42 or 42th page. I don't know what to call that. And let's do a quick refresh here. And if I were to find the data, now where is the data in the console? I'm trying to find it. Here we go. Here it is. So you can see here the info we have next is equal to null. So if the next is equal to null, then we want to disable the next button. So let's go over here. And what we're going to very simply say is disable. We're going to disable this button if the data.info.next is equal to null. So we're going to do the bang right over here to make it true over here. So as you can see that this works. And now if I were to click here, we can go to previous. Of course, we still can't go to next because we didn't do that logic yet. So over here, let's actually copy this on click. And so this very simply is going to do the exact same thing, except it's just going to add one. So let's go ahead and refresh that. And now we can go to previous. You can see here we get this kind of weird effect, and we'll fix that a little bit later. But if I go to next, and notice that we already for the next one, the next set of data, we already fetched the data. So you can see here we're not going to get that effect because it's going to cache that data. How terrific is that? You can see here all this data is cached and it's very, very smooth. Now if I were to go to previous one more time, you can see that we get this weird kind of effect because this data isn't cached anymore. But now it is because we fetched it. So let's actually figure out how we can fix this effect. I really don't like it at all. This effect where, you know, we get this kind of re-render. We don't care about the previous data. We just want to fetch the new one. So what we can do here to fix this is to keep this previous data. And then once this previous data is done rendering, or once we get our next data, we can just replace it with the previous data. Because right now what's happening is it's completely emptying out this data over here, and then it's trying to render the next one. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and fetch the data, but keep this data until you're done fetching it. And once you're done fetching it, then replace the data with this data. And we can actually do this very easily with the right over here inside of the query. We can actually just apply it with an option. So right over here inside of this option, we can very simply say keep previous data, and I'm going to say true to this. So now what's going to happen is it's going to keep this data until it fetches the next data. So over here, if I go to previous, you can see that was kind of it's a smoother effect, as you can see. So we're keeping this data until we fetch the next one. So now we don't have that really weird effect that we were getting before. Now this does cause a potential issue, because what if we're at the previous data and we want to click next? We actually want to prevent that ability. So what we can do to prevent that ability is very simply go here, and we can actually access something called is previous data. So over here we can say that if this is the previous data, well, over here, and there is no next data, we want to disable it. So now if we're at the previous data, and so if we're at the previous data, we should not be able to click the next. So let's go over here. Let's actually go to one where we didn't cache it. So very faintly, very quickly, maybe if I can throttle this a little bit. So let's go over here to network. If not, you might just have to take my word for it. Let's go to slow. Let's go to next here. So very faintly, we should not be able to fetch the previous data. I guess it's just a little too fast. Maybe what I can do is I can console.log is previous data over here. So let's go here, console.log is previous data. So now if I go here, you can see initially for a quick second it's true. And when this is true, we're not gonna be able to click on this next button. But it's just going way too fast for now. Okay, so that's pretty much everything. So I think that pretty much covers everything that we need to know. One thing I do want to note is that this actually returns quite a bit of things. So if you don't want to use something like status, what you can do is very simply do something like is loading. And this can actually replace this right over here. Also, you can say is error. And this can replace this right over here. And this should behave in exactly the same way. So now let's actually go over here. Let's move this back to 1. And if I were to click next, we get this awesome little application. And you can see how easy that is. This would have been a real pain to accomplish with just simple fetch. But now with this React query library, this is a lot simpler and a lot easier and a lot nicer. We're actually getting a lot of this cool caching effect. Okay, so that pretty much sums up this tutorial. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.